Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome all, real people and virtual people, and whoever else may be listening in. If you're following the conversation on Twitter, please use hashtag #ShapingSanctions. As last night's announcement on DPRK suggests, sanctions are both a hot foreign policy tool, much in the news, central to top-grade issues like Russia, Iran, DPRK. Sanctions are much used, much talked about, and often misunderstood. And given the importance of sanctions, both symbolic and substantive, the Atlantic Council has established a new sanctions program which aims to bring together key stakeholders from the administration, Congress, policy communities, businesses, to improve the sanctions tool, develop best practices, address misunderstandings and cliches, and avoid pitfalls. I'd like to thank the sponsors, Hogan & Lovells, PricewaterhouseCoopers, David Aufhauser, David Metzner, some of our partners in the sanctions program. Many thanks to you. Also, I'd like to thank Georgetown University's Institute of International Economic Law, which has been a partner for this event. The Atlantic Council sanctions team includes some of the best in the business, professionals with hands-on experience in designing sanctions programs, veterans of Treasury, State, and NSC, plus regional experts. Brian O'Toole, Andrew Keller, Ajay Kuntamakala, David Mortlock, Dalip Singh, Michael Greenwald, Anders Ostland, and others are part of the team here, which aims to provide the best analysis and recommendations on sanctions available. I've been working with Bart Osterfeld and his Global Business and Economic Program at the Atlantic Council, so we're pleased to launch both today's event and this program. We've got two panels today, one focused on policy perspectives from current and former practitioners, including some on our team, but also Andrea Gacki of OFAC, a former colleague and now a friend in policy. There are others on our team in this panel, I think Michael Greenwald, and then the other panel will include business people, Richard Sawaya, Frederick Shaheen, Robert Walsh. Finally, Undersecretary of the Treasury, Sigal Mandelker, the administration's senior person on sanctions, will deliver what I suspect will be a serious statement of this administration's approach to sanctions. So I look forward to an in-depth, lively, and who knows, maybe more than lively discussion. At this point, let's get started, and I'd like the first panel to come to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. My name is Andrew Keller. I'm a partner in the International Trade Group at Hogan Lovells and previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Sanctions at the State Department. It's a true privilege to have the opportunity to moderate this panel with five exceptional individuals who I'm proud to call former colleagues and friends. And I have to say, I can't think of a better time for this panel, which is entitled Best Practices, Past Errors, and the Future of Sanctions. Given the incredible change that we've seen over the last year, including as a result of the change in administrations and clearly as a result of congressional action, I've given these panelists the very small task of walking through how these changes will impact the use of sanctions as a foreign policy and national security tool, and what those changes will mean for the private sector and for our allies going forward. Of course, they have to do all this within an hour. Easy task. So I'd like to introduce each of our panelists, and then I've asked them to give a brief opening statement. I'm going to start with our government colleagues, who we're very pleased to have here today. Sitting immediately to my left, we have Andrea Gacki. And Andrea is currently the Deputy Director at OFAC. And I think maybe we can sum up her OFAC experience by saying she has held almost every critical position at the agency. Andrea previously served contemporaneously as the Acting Deputy Director of the agency and as the Associate Director for Compliance and Enforcement from 2014 to March 2017. She was also OFAC's Assistant Director for Licensing from 2010 to 2014, and she, prior to that, served as a Senior Sanctions Advisor for Policy and Implementation. Before OFAC, she was a trial attorney in the Civil Division at the Department of Justice, including as a senior member of the Justice Department's Terrorism Designation Team. Andrea, thanks for joining us. David Tesler. David is currently the Deputy Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. You can tell how important and valued David's work is because there's been a decades-long interagency struggle between State and Treasury for where he's going to work. He started his career in the heady times of the late 90s as a Foreign Service officer, and he was stationed in Bucharest, Baghdad, the U.S. mission to the United Nations, and also held various positions in Washington, D.C. Subsequent to that, David spent several years at the Treasury Department, first as the Senior Advisor to the Director of OFAC, and then following that as the Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary for Terrorism, Finance, and Financial Intelligence. Brian O'Toole. Glad you're here as well. Brian is currently a non-resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council. Immediately prior to that, he was serving as the senior advisor to the director of OFAC. Brian is a recognized expert on economic sanctions and is focusing his work on the intersection of economics, national security, and economic and financial sanctions. I'll just note that prior to his time at Treasury, he also served as an analyst in Treasury's, prior to his time at OFAC, he served as an analyst in Treasury's Office of International Affairs, and he also served at the Central Intelligence Agency. Ambassador Dan Freed really needs no introduction, but I will simply say that prior to joining the Atlantic Council, in his current capacity, he served in the Foreign Service for 40 years. He played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. He served as an assistant to the president and NSC senior director for Presidents Clinton and Bush. He was the ambassador to Poland, and he also was the assistant secretary for European affairs from 2005 to 2009 at the State Department. And last but not least, we have Elizabeth Rosenberg. Liz is a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. She is the director of the Energy, Economics, and Security program there. And she publishes, she speaks regularly, and she is a recognized expert on the intersection of energy, sanctions, and economic statecraft. Liz also has significant experience at senior levels of the Treasury Department, where she served as the senior advisor for 4 years for the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and then also as the senior advisor to the Undersecretary for Terrorism, Finance, and Financial Intelligence. Prior to joining the government, Liz was a correspondent, an energy policy correspondent at Argus Media here in Washington. So I will stop talking now, and I'll ask Andrea to kick things off and deliver a brief opening statement. And Andrea, you can speak from the podium or stay in your chair because we're mic'd up.
Speak from the podium, if that's
Great.
all right.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yep, and I'll just switch here.
Thank you so much, Andrew. But thank you to everyone. It's really a pleasure to help kick off today's exciting program and to be on the stage with so many friends and current or former colleagues, but first and foremost, friends. And also to see so many great familiar faces in the audience. So I think we all know, because we all practice in this area, that sanctions can be extremely powerful tools, especially when used strategically and with precision. They freeze assets of illicit actors, cut them off from the U.S. financial system and economy, and restrict their ability to interface with the international financial system. In addition to protecting the U.S. financial system from abuse, sanctions are intended to increase pressure on regimes and actors with the goals of changing their behavior. Sanctions can be structured and scoped in ways to achieve those objectives and modulate that pressure. For example, we can limit access to certain types of financing or prohibit certain transactions without a full freezing of all transactions and assets. When deployed in support of clearly defined objectives and utilized in conjunction with the country's other national security tools and authorities, including diplomacy, sanctions can be key to achieving our foreign policy goals. Additionally, our domestic sanctions can be even more effective when paired with multilateral action, whether that's through the European Union or the United Nations, to help increase pressure and change behavior. Now, we always work to carefully evaluate how our sanctions can be implemented by the private sector. And we seek as much as possible to provide clear guidance and respond to your questions through frequently asked questions, answers to frequently asked questions, through guidance, and through opening up at OFAC a variety of different ways to approach the agency for guidance. In addition, we, in fora such as this, we stand ready to listen to your concerns, to your issues, as we continue to adapt and structure sanctions to make them the most effective, understandable, and implementable tool that we can achieve to serve the very important foreign policy and national security aims that they're designed to accomplish. Now, while sanctions aren't the solution to every foreign policy issue, as Dan alluded to in the opening remarks, they can have a significant impact. Specifically, we have focused so much of our recent efforts at OFAC and dedicated to the threat from the North Korean regime. We've restricted its ability to move money through the international financial system and disrupted revenue-generating exports and other prohibited trade. We've aggressively ramped up our actions, and by targeting certain evasion schemes and sending a strong and clear message to partners and allies, we've seen the North Korean regime grow even more isolated and now indicate that they are ready to come to the table. We will continue to target these and other illicit and malign activities and actors that threaten our national security, not only with respect to North Korea, but also threats like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela. Looking to the future, I think we can all agree here in this room that you'll continue to see sanctions as a primary tool of foreign policy, and continue to be targeted and continue to be deployed in ever more targeted, specific, and impactful ways. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague David Tesler, and also say that I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
I'm going to speak from the chair because I was told that that's what I should do.
Oh, sorry.
I wanted to just use these 5 minutes to lay out a few principles for the effective use of sanctions, and they key off much of what Andrea just said, which is not surprising because we've worked together for a long time, so think alike. But the first principle, and this seems obvious, both Dan said it and Andrea mentioned it several times, is that sanctions are a tool of foreign policy. And the reason why this is an important principle, although it may seem obvious, is with the proliferation of the use of sanctions, I think it's important to remember that. It is designed to advance specific foreign policy goals and defend our national security. So when looking at a foreign policy set of issues, it's important to think holistically about what are our end states, where do we want to go, what are the strategic arcs, policy arcs that are going to get us to those end states, and how do sanctions as a tool in the foreign policy toolbox fit into that. That's principle number 1. Principle number 2 is, if you're going to use sanctions, really understand the targets, how the targets think, and design the sanctions in a targeted and creative way to affect the behavior change you want. 2 examples, Andrea mentioned one of them, is North Korea. Over the past year, this administration has focused quite a bit of energy and time into energy sanctions, looking at coal, looking at oil, refined petroleum, ship-to-ship transfers, because of an analysis and an assessment of how energy sanctions would actually impact the target and the calculus. Here the target is Kim Jong-un and his calculus. Another example, also with energy sanctions, in fact, is Venezuela and the creative use of sanctions to target PDVSA, also in an effort to impact behavior change of Maduro. So to look at sanctions and use them creatively and in a targeted way, that's principle number 2. And principle number 3, and this is where I spend a lot of my time, and that is building coalitions of allies and partners to help leverage the United States' power in sanctions and to be a force multiplier. And you've seen over the past year this administration highlight the importance of coalitions of partners and allies across the board. So whether it's in the CATSA realm and our close coordination with Europe vis-a-vis Russia malign activity, and that's not only Ukraine and Crimea, but it's the broad spectrum of Russia's malign activity, or working with Gulf allies and our European partners to combat Iran's destabilizing activities in the region, or working with Asian partners like Japan and South Korea to target North Korea and to help augment our maximum pressure campaign. So you see that with this administration, I think, across the board, and that's where I spend a lot of my time, but that is, I would say, the third principle in looking at how to effectively implement sanctions programs. So.
Great. Well, as all the other panelists have said, it's great to be here and see all these folks in the audience, many of whom are former colleagues and friends, and be up here with a bunch of my friends as well. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to focus some of my remarks today from kind of the Atlantic Council perspective, more I think on the mechanics of sanctions. I'm going to let Dan talk about some of the policy, and when I say let Dan talk about policy, I mean he's much more qualified to do it than I am, so it just makes sense. From a mechanical standpoint, I think one of the hallmarks of this administration is that you can really see kind of the work of the professionals behind the actions that have happened. And I think this is especially true you have to cut through some of the noise in the media. I think this administration, for better or worse, has a much louder media presence and a much more chaotic media presence than the previous one. But if you look through and actually see the actions that have come forward, it still is kind of the same stuff we were doing when I was in government, in the Obama administration and before. There's a real technical aspect, and I'll just highlight quickly the North Korea action from about 2 weeks ago, where it was billed as the biggest action ever on North Korea, which is true if you go by the numbers, but from a kind of sweeping standpoint, probably not exactly accurate. But that doesn't really matter. What matters is that it was a really significant action, and I think one of the things that it showed was it's the kind of action that really drives a knife deeper into somebody's side, right? You had an action going after kind of the shipping networks that the North uses. As David said, there's been this big focus on the shipping because that's what facilitates the energy procurement, and the energy procurement drives their nuclear program. And it was a highly technical and really competent action. And so I think, I think the administration is to be applauded for that. And one of the things that, I've very much noticed, more from the Treasury side because that's where I'm more familiar, but I think it's from state as well, is the senior officials are really letting kind of the professionals, the people who've been doing this, like David and Andrea for years and years and years, they've given them the running room to do the job and do the job right. I think that's really encouraging when you think about how these tools are applied to these foreign policy and national security crises. All that said, I do think there are some cracks that have shown a little bit in the implementation, and to be frank, I don't chalk that up to a lack of expertise or willingness on the part of the politicals to let the professionals do their job. I think they're resource related. Sanctions are a tool that everybody turns to now. Every time there's a crisis, Congress says, what are we going to impose sanctions on? We have turned to this tool probably more often than we should, to be frank. And there hasn't been the corresponding investment in these tools. One example that I'll give, and I think this is a resource-related issue for any of you who've been in government, as you're going through a kind of chaotic policy process, right? Certain things may slip through the crack, especially if you don't have the amount of people that you need on the target. But with the Venezuela EO that came out, which imposed some really smart sanctions, I think in general on Venezuela, there was a kind of provision in there that targeted Venezuelan government bonds. Right. The issue with the implementation, though, is it targeted all Venezuelan government bonds, and then at the same time that they released the executive order, OFAC had to issue a general license exempting effectively everything but one Venezuelan government bond. Right. So you have this kind of X target, and then X minus one is everything that you're letting go. So I think it's caused that caused a lot of reaction, especially in the financial industry. Where people were scrambling to figure out, oh my gosh, do I hold bonds? Do they all meet the numbers on these lists? When that didn't really need to happen, and those resources, both in the government that were answering these questions from the financial industry and the financial industry itself, could have been better used to actually implement the sanctions. So I think it's critical that the administration and Congress get together and figure out a way to fund this appropriately. And I'm not talking about a couple $1 million here and there. What they need is it's about a 50% budget increase is what I've said in various fora before. I think the administration has taken a real solid first step in putting a significant increase in the budget proposal in the president's budget. I think Congress is taking this seriously as well, but it's similar to kind of an investment Congress made in FinCEN a number of years ago to really revolutionize FinCEN's IT infrastructure and kind of the backbone that they rest BSA enforcement on. And I think a similar effort here is needed to make this work as well as we need it to work to confront these crises that we're facing. And then finally, kind of looking forward, I think there are a couple things that I'd like to touch on. The first is, I think we can expect to see that same level of professionalism in the actions that this administration is going to take, especially where there's kind of a consistent policy message and a real kind of focus with the United States and our allies. I do think there is, at least in certain programs, and I'm going to say Russia because I think it needs to be said, a cap on how far that professionalism will extend. Because I do think this administration has certain issues with Russia. I don't think we need to get into them too much, but I do think what it means is that at some point that professional running room is probably going to run into a cap, and I think we need to bear that in mind as we think about how these challenges are going to play out. And then finally, I think a lot of us in this room, certainly a lot of us at the Atlantic Council, tend to view kind of foreign policy and national security, especially at the highest level, in an analytic rubric that is very focused on what we all learned in school and we all practiced for a long time, which is that international relations is about relations and these long-standing relationships. And I think that's fine from an analytic perspective, but I think if you're trying to prognosticate about where this administration, especially for kind of the top-level political issues, is going to end up, I think we really need to start thinking about these things from a predictive standpoint in a more transactional manner, because I think that's the hallmark of the president and certainly kind of the key decision makers who surround him at the most senior levels of this government. So I think there have been, I've given up trying to predict some of these things because I've had trouble with that myself, but I think we need to start thinking about, as we predict, what a transactional model looks like. And what that means. And I think it's harder because you're not always going to know the inputs into those transactional decisions, but I do think it's kind of the correct way that we need to evaluate what these very high-level things are going to come down to, including the North Korea negotiations that hopefully will be starting soon.
By request of Ambassador Fried, Liz, you are up next.
I'll go next. Giving the last word to Ambassador Fried. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and thank you all for coming to this important conversation. So I thought I'd offer, so as not to be redundant with some of the excellent comments we've heard so far, I thought I'd offer a few comments on Congress and its role on sanctions, and maybe this is the political or the sandbox fight part of the conversation. But I know that many people in the foreign policy and compliance world tend to focus on the administration when it comes to sanctions. I expect that that's a real focus for many of you who are here today. Obviously, they are the implementer and the enforcer, and to the extent that there's a multilateral component to the sanctions, it's really up to the administration, of course, and its diplomatic initiatives to engage with counterparts and to build the coalitions and the joint actions that can come forward and that have the greatest effect and leverage when they are so joined internationally. Also, of course, the administration has been really creative and innovative in the way that it has implemented these sanctions. I'm thinking just, for example, of the SSI list, creation of that, and some new ways to go after violators of human rights, for example, and thinking of some of the initiatives to try and more closely pair export control measures with law enforcement actions, with sanctions to amplify the policy effect. So that's attracted a lot of attention, and of course the op-temp for administrative action on sanctions catches a lot of news coverage. But nevertheless, back to Congress, is really significant in this debate. Some of you, I know, are keen on that point, and I want to make 3 quick points about the role of Congress on sanctions. Specifically, that they are a very significant originator and innovator and disruptor when it comes to sanctions. And I'll tell you a little bit what I mean by that. As far as originator, for those of you concerned with the specific authorities and how they organize the way in which these sanctions are implemented, of course you know that Congress is the originator. They created the backbone, the architecture on which all of these initiatives that have been mentioned so far rest. And that means that they also have the authority and ability to change it and take it away. I don't think we focus on that so often, and it's certainly politically difficult for them to do that all of a sudden without quite a lot of coalition building and advanced work. But they've had a couple of recent cases which have reminded people of that ultimate congressional authority. And not to forget their role as an originator on budget issues. Brian was mentioning how significant they are in giving resources to the implementation and execution, enforcement of sanctions, which is a real enabler or disabler of all this activity that we're talking about. As far as the role of Congress as an innovator, I would argue that they are at least as important as the administration in innovating new approaches to sanctions and creating some of the intellectual capital, which may not ultimately take the form of the measures that are implemented or the enforcement, but in expanding the conversation. Sometimes that's scary for covered entities who are looking at how to implement these measures. And this innovation is both substantive and it's strategic. So substantive, think about what they did in putting together some of the Iran measures from 2012, such as the energy framework for restrictions on Iran's export of petroleum, including compelling the revenues of allowed petroleum to be held in accounts of the purchasing country. These really interesting and elaborative creative work that they've done. On strategy, you're all familiar with the good cop, bad cop dynamic that so characterized much of the sanctions work over the last 20 years, up and down, and the signaling work that they do. And I think it's appropriate to consider some of the sanctions bills introduced in Congress as, initially at least, more bark and more fury than they ever planned to originally wind up at, which is to say they are expressions that may be more emotional, that may be effective as a signaling tool, more so, much more so than the effort to eventually legislate and create the authorities that will then guide what the administration does. And we've seen that be incredibly effective. If you were watching the precursor to what became CATSA, so this was December of 2016, right, if I have that right, it was much more aggressive, if you will, than where we wound up in that for CATSA. And that the Deter Act now, also in the Russia space, I think we should consider also significantly messaging in its character. Last, on the issue of Congress being a disruptor. This is a way to characterize what they've done to push the envelope on policy and even pushing aside administration priorities. And this isn't specific to the current administration or to party. We saw this in the last administration very sharply. Think about INARA and Congress's major recent push to take a stronger role in foreign policy, to have greater oversight of the administration, trying to constrain President Obama's actions with regard to the Iran deal, or constrain under CATSA this administration's action with regard to implementation of Russia sanctions. And I will close by saying we're still in that moment looking forward to the May waiver deadlines connected to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, where the president has asked Congress, maybe ultimatum is better than using the phrase to ask, as well as European partners to take action on issues he finds concerning with the Iran nuclear deal. So Congress has the opportunity to be a disruptor and to change the policy course the president has set out, which is to say that he will not renew the sanctions, he will cancel the Iran deal essentially, unless and until he is satisfied by Congress with policy actions in this domain. So I'll stop there.
Of course, those waiver deadlines themselves are a way of Congress maintaining control, or efforts to maintain control.
They created the waiver deadlines.
Right.
They are the only body that can change them.
So,
right.
Thank you, Liz. Last but definitely not least, Ambassador Fried.
4 points. First, in Andrea Gacki and David Tesler, you have examples of the deep professional competence that this administration can draw on in designing and implementing sanctions policy. They know what they're doing, and at Treasury especially, Andrea represents a deeply competent, skilled bureaucracy. And having had nothing to do with the building of that bureaucracy, this is not self-serving. It is of tremendous comfort to know that there are people who can actually do their job and do what they say they're going to do. This is a tool which cannot be taken for granted and needs to be cherished. Second point related, the competent people in the administration need the resources to work with. Brian mentioned funding. That's true. I think Treasury is well organized to fulfill its sanctions role. It needs more people and more money. The State Department, well, okay, full disclosure, the office at the State Department, the Office of the Sanctions Coordinator at State, my old job, was abolished. David Tesler is the closest thing the State Department has to the Sanctions Coordinator. He's a good guy, okay? I know he's sitting here, but I'll tell you, he's a good guy, all right? There's nothing wrong with him, but he's only one guy, okay? He's one guy. I had a staff. He's got himself, and he's got a day job. He's Deputy Director of Policy Planning. If this administration is going to use sanctions, it should remember that sanctions work best when the legal, analytic, and policy skills of OFAC and Treasury's other sanctions offices are combined with the diplomatic skills of the Department of State. All right, so that's a big deal, and that needs to be fixed. A third point, David mentioned this, Andrea mentioned this, effective sanctions policy is not a unilateral action. It requires allies. Now, they said it, but the administration is going to have to mean it. When we go to the Europeans or the Japanese about, for example, Russia sanctions, we are asking governments to tell their businesses to take major hits. And we have to decide how much political capital to invest in sanctions policy and how much political capital to spend on other things, like tariffs. We have to figure, this is not one where the tracks are independent. The tracks have to be integrated. And if we're going to be successful in the implementation of sanctions, we need to do it in tandem with our allies, or it's not going to work. Then it becomes exercises in feel-good, which has its uses, especially inside Washington, but really I don't care. Feel-good is not interesting. Results are interesting, and you need allies. A fourth point, sanctions are not a policy. They are a tool to advance a policy, which leads to suspicion that you better know what your policy is. And it's better be clear up and down the line, including to your allies. Now, of the three big sanctions programs in this administration, Russia, Iran, DPRK, there are questions about the policy. On Iran, are we or are we not going to use sanctions within the framework of the JCPOA? And if not, what is the alternative? And I understand sanctions cannot make Iran into a much better country. They can and have gotten Iran to sign the JCPOA and adhere to it. That's one question. A next question on North Korea. Sanctions are designed, as was said earlier, to drive North Korea to the negotiating table. Now, maybe that has been achieved, in which case all power to the administration. There's nothing wrong with playing a high-stakes, tough game. Sometimes you can't do it the way the Foreign Service bureaucracy would prefer you to do it, which is methodically and step by step. So I'm not knocking the high stakes. But the North Koreans have been down this road before. They've been doing bait and switch for 20 years. Ask Wendy Sherman, Madeleine Albright, anybody who worked in any of the administrations about what it's like when the ruling dynasty gives its word. To make this work, we will need a durable framework so everybody knows what our strategic choices are and what we're looking for. Now, I hope we're there. I'm not going to trash the announcement last night. It might lead to something. But we've been back and forth on whether or not we would talk to the North Koreans at all. And sanctions cannot be turned on and off instantly. It requires a lot of pushing. So it's a question mark. On Russia, I think the gap between professional competence in the implementation of sanctions and questions about the policy is clear. The Russia sanctions have been implemented by the Trump administration over the past year in a competent, credible fashion. If you follow the details of Treasury's sanctions maintenance, tinkering of the Russia sanctions, they've been good and sometimes actually pretty clever. The administration prepared Section 241 of CATSA, the so-called Kremlin report, by all accounts, with a high degree of skill, professionalism, and deep analytic judgment. This is a classified report. I haven't seen it, but people who have seen it, including political opponents of the administration, agree that it's better than a solid job. It's an exemplary job. And yet, in the rollout, the administration first tried to hide the good work it had done, then issued a non-credible public list, then retreated from that and said it was going to draw on the classified list for additional sanctions, and there have been various public hints that that's exactly what it's doing. Now, this would be a good thing. This could end well. But sanctions policy has to be integrated into the main policy, or else you have heat generated by friction that does no good. This is to say all of these major sanctions issues, Russia, Iran, DPRK, could be effective. The elements for effective policy is there. But the policy framework needs to be clear, it needs to be understood. There's nothing wrong with tactical unpredictability. That can be a useful lever. But operational unreliability is seldom useful. And I hope the administration finds a way to use the asset of tactical unpredictability without falling into the trap of operational unreliability. And finally, transparency with Congress and the business community is critical. The way you stay, this is Laura's point, but I'm making it kind of a crude summary because that's what I do. For Congress, the way to keep them from going off into crazy land is to stay ahead of them. You know, be thinking of all their objections and be able to answer it. And you will be pleased by the results. But you can't do that unless you have the resources and the policy and the strategy and you've got the allies lined up. Then Congress can be a help and not a disruptor, right? I hope some of the questions I've laid out will be answered by Sigal Mandelker, who, by the way, is one of the people representing the deep competence available to this administration. It's not just the career people, it is political appointees also who are skilled, smart, strategic thinkers and able. So I hope to get some of these questions answered today and have more questions besides. Thanks.
Thanks to all of you for extremely thoughtful and I think interesting remarks that give a lot of fodder for our conversation. I hate to be accused of shamelessly chasing the headlines, but I'm going to shamelessly chase the headlines. And I think Dan mentioned, President Trump may be meeting with Kim Jong-un in the next few months. Everybody on this stage, as you heard, seems to agree that sanctions are a tool to incentivize behavior change and a tool to help achieve foreign policy and national security goals. So I'm wondering if we can think of the North Koreans' willingness to talk as at least the beginning of a sanctions success story. And I think this administration has clearly taken a very strong and aggressive position towards sanctions against North Korea. I think we also saw in the last administration a shift from non-proliferation sanctions to broader-based sanctions that really target most, if not all, of North Korea's revenue sources. So and Dan, you've already alluded to this, so maybe I'll start or ask some of our other colleagues to start off with A, whether this can be thought of as the beginning of a success story, and B, how and whether economic sanctions can truly be effective with a regime that for so long has seemed to not have any interest with being part of the international economy or any legitimate international commercial activity, and similarly hasn't shown any interest in being responsive to its citizens and their needs. So if I have any volunteers to kick that off. David.
I would say that it's too early to tell if it's been a success. I think what it does show is that the shift from strategic patience to a new policy of maximum pressure is having an effect. I think that's what you can tell from, until now. And I think it's important also to underline that the maximum pressure campaign is going to continue until the North Koreans actually match these words with deeds, right? So we're not going to let up at all. The maximum pressure campaign is going to continue. But I think that the announcement yesterday is a sign that it is starting to work and it's having an effect. And that is through a lot of hard work, coalition building, working with the Chinese. You questioned whether or not the regime that clearly doesn't care about its people could be impacted by sanctions. They care about their survival, right? And when you really target the economic levers that can threaten its survival, like energy, for example, and you work to really first adopt very, very strong UN Security Council resolutions, and then work with allies and partners and China, and recognizing China is critical here, to actually robustly implement those strong sanctions, those strong resolutions, then you start to see, perhaps, that we're pushing on the levers that matter to the regime. So.
And I can really only agree with everything David just said. At OFAC, we have shifted our resources, and you'll hear this from Undersecretary Mandelker during her keynote, but we have many urgent national security priorities that we are facing, but North Korea is first among them. We have adapted, and we are constantly looking with the State Department for both the right nodes of pressure, but also the right ways to affect the regime calculus. That will continue. I mean, I think last night's announcement is welcome, but it's too early to say. And the maximum pressure campaign is not going to let up yet.
I agree that the administration deserves credit for ramping up the pressure on North Korea. I think that the Obama policy of strategic patience went on for 7.5 years without serious result. And in the last 6 months, of the Obama administration, they decided, hey, this is not working, and oh my God, the North Korean timeline is of developing strategic nuclear capability is a lot shorter than we thought it was, which is when some of us got the running room to do more. But the credit for implementing that, for making it happen at the UN and bilaterally, goes to this administration. They ran with it. The strategic assumption of a shift to maximum pressure, I think, is the correct one. I think the question will come now, what we do when that moment arrives that the North Korean regime is not negotiating in good faith, as I think it will. So what do we do then? But that's a better problem to have than where we were. So I'll credit the administration for this one. And One of the cliches of North Korea was that sanctions are useless because the regime is so determined to have strategic nuclear weapons and so ruthless and vicious that no amount of pressure will possibly work. So give it up. I mean, I can't tell you how many North Korea experts kept telling me sanctions won't work, give it up. Yeah. Kim Jong-un will never give up his nuclear capacity willingly. The question is, as Lenin used to say, how do you sharpen the contradictions? How do you make it tougher for him? And I think that's the strategic basis for maximum pressure. Mm-hmm. But again, we now have issues before us. A bilateral meeting at the level of presidents, that's a gift to Kim. And he's going to, there will come various moments of truth, and you don't need me telling you. I know, y'all know it. But look, morning after, this is actually pretty good since it's the kind of signal we were hoping for. Some sign of movement.
I would just make a brief point on top of what everybody here has already said, and I agree with Dan. I think the administration deserves tremendous credit for this work. The maximum pressure campaign, I think, has been very successful. We will see whether we can call this a successful kind of diplomatic engagement, as David mentioned in his opening remarks, that was bolstered by sanctions. But I think one thing, too, that I'd like to come back to, one of the things that Dan said in his opening remarks, is everything's interrelated, remember, right? And this is not a novel point, other people have made it, but I think it's worth saying, which is what happens on May 12th with Iran JCPOA renewal is going to be instructive for the North Koreans when they sit down to try to negotiate with us. And I think this administration needs to remember that those policies are intertwined regardless of what may have been said on the campaign trail and whether, the JCPOA is really the worst deal ever. And I think, the North Koreans will be watching, the Chinese will be watching, the Russians will be watching, and I think it's going to be very important for the success of any sort of negotiations with the North Koreans, to the extent that the Kim administration or regime is even, it's not an administration, right, if it's a dynasty, to the extent that the Kim regime is serious about sitting down to make sure that they have a serious partner on our side and that we'll stick by any commitments that we make. So I think that's going to be something that everybody should pay attention to, not only for Iran and issues in that region, but as they apply to Northeast Asia as well.
You have already made all of my good points. In 10 seconds, I will just add, I agree with Brian, context and history matters. Context of the JCPOA will be incredibly significant for North Korea, as well as for anyone concerned with nuclear arms control and international or multilateral cooperation on that front. And remember too, BDA, the Banco Delta Asia, the original real heavy hammer that woke up North Korea attention and actually became the model on which all of that successful Iran pressure was modeled subsequently. We know that the bureaucracy supporting sanctions and this cultivation of economic leverage is well-functioning and well-staffed at this point. What matters and what will be the answer to this story is how the capacity and how carefully the administration is able to deliver on the diplomatic and negotiating side. I fear that there are inadequate ranks. So David, don't get a cold. To do with this economic pressure that has been cultivated what must be done in order to really advance the diplomatic work towards a successful negotiation.
Why don't we shift gears and talk a little bit about CATSA and Russia in particular. And I think it's fair to say that between 2014 and 2016, one of the, and perhaps the top priority of the government in moving forward on the Russia sanctions front was to move forward with the Europeans and to maintain transatlantic unity. That, to a certain extent, has been thrown off balance, I think in large part by CATSA, which obviously was not an administration effort, but a congressional effort. and also to a certain extent by the current political dynamic. And I'm wondering, and maybe I'll ask David and Andrea to sort of start off, sort of if you can talk about what efforts you've made to engage the Europeans as far as, while CATSA was under consideration and in the implementation phase, especially given, I think, the symbolic importance of showing unity with the Europeans over Russia sanctions, and similarly the importance with regard to the private sector. I think the original sanctions were really rolled out in a way and implemented in a way that they were never going to be analogous between the United States and the European Union, but they were sufficiently harmonious to at least make things somewhat easier on the private sector. So perhaps if you, either of you could comment on that.
Sure, I'll kick it off. I think, Andrew, there was a fear last summer that CATSA might impact our close coordination and transatlantic unity, and I think that we, through hard work and a lot of energy and time, have proven that fear wrong. And I think, Andrea and I are leaving for Europe next week. This will be my 5th time there to talk about Russia sanctions since September, which is a lot of time in Europe. The Europeans have come here quite a bit, and I think if you ask them, I think that when we first went in September or even in August, started talking about the fact that we want to maintain, and not only maintain, but strengthen the close coordination, there was a little bit of skepticism on their side, but the proof is in the pudding, right? And so we worked very closely with them through the end of October when we issued our joint guidance, Treasury and State. We took into account a lot of views from the Europeans, also the private sector, which maybe Andrea can talk about, but there's also very close coordination there. But I think through the actual work, we've shown that we can actually use CATSA to strengthen our cooperation. It's important also to remember that CATSA not only articulates the very serious threats that the Russians pose vis-a-vis eastern Ukraine and Crimea, but CATSA really lays out the broad spectrum of Russian threats, including, undermining democratic processes, cyber, corruption, human rights, etc. So it's a broad articulation and a strong one, and we have, I think, shown that we are implementing it robustly and in close, working closely with the Europeans, and I think the Europeans are happy with where we are today.
And I would just like to echo everything David said. OFAC has working with the State Department has helped engage with the European governments, but also with the private sector, not only here in the United States, but worldwide. After the passage of CATSA, many questions came into us, excuse me, as to how we might interpret certain terms, et cetera. We had not only an open door policy for those questions so we could broadly consider how to answer them, but also proposed answers, which I know folks may have individually heard me say this time and again, but we welcome proposed questions and proposed answers. We may not agree with the answer, and we'll decide what the answer is at the end of the day, but that was something that we aggressively excuse me, looked at in implementation of CATSA.
On the issue of CATSA management, I think the administration has done a good job working with Europe to limit CATSA's more questionable provisions. The drafters of CATSA know that it's a mixed bag, some good, some not so good. And I think I give the administration credit. But to stay ahead of the congressional politics and avoid being slammed, it's important for the administration to show what it is going to do. And I hope that what David Tesler said is a hint that when Treasury comes out with its next tranche of sanctions, and I'm not giving away anything that Secretary Mnuchin hasn't already said publicly, or Dan Coates, I hope it addresses this. I think, and I think you nailed it, I agree, that there is considerable potential for cooperation with Europe to use the sanctions tool in response to a different kind of Russian threat than Ukraine, which is their attacks on our Western political systems and use of disinformation and cyber hacking. You know, the French, the Spanish, the Balts, the Poles, they're all facing this. I don't think that those governments, I don't think the Macron, I don't think the Elysee has forgotten what the Russians tried to do in the last days of the French presidential election. I think there's real potential here. There are a variety of tools, including Section 241, my personal favorite. And I think that the US and Europe have the potential to make it clear to the Russians that there will be consequences for further interference. And the stars may be aligned because, you know, in Washington terms, it may be imperative to be seen as doing this, and it's the right policy. So, you know, go get them.
I'm going to go to Liz, and then please get your questions ready. I know you've been waiting, and we'll turn to the audience for some Q&A.
I'll be brief. This is the space to watch. This has been helpful in talking about the history of CATSA development and implementation so far. But looking forward, the animating issue in the US public discourse that really drives attention on Russia-related foreign policy is no longer Ukraine. It isn't what Russia is doing in Syria. It's not any of that. What it is more specifically concern about interference in US elections and to a certain extent malicious cyber activity. Europeans are also concerned. I see very little potential that they will join the United States in any sanctions activity in that space, notwithstanding the fact that there is potential to do so written into the CATSA authorities. The European approach has been much more operational, looking specifically at what they did in the Macron case. This is an area for debate and discussion. I think this is the one, and we'll see what happens, but this is the space to watch.
I have about 30 other CATSA questions, but I see a question right up front.
Thank you.
Could, sir, and I should remind all of our questioners, if you could please introduce yourself and mention your affiliation.
Okay.
Thank you.
You for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Reagan Foundation. Dan, you mentioned that the sanctions will not work without allies or their cooperation, which is true. Regarding North Korea, 90% of their trade is with China, and you know that. For a fact, I do know there is pipeline going in to North Korea from China. I'm talking about oil. So my question is, what can we do about China? What should we do how can we deal with that? Because without that, the sanction may not be working not as good as we designed to. So that's just my natural question. Thank you for coming.
I'll give the Trump administration credit for getting China to agree to do far more than they wanted to, 2 years ago. The Chinese ban on imports of North Korean coal is not complete, but it's pretty good. I mean, it's hitting their money. So coal, textile, fishery exports, we've hit those hard, and the Chinese have moved a lot. They've moved partly because I think they believe the Trump administration was serious in its threats to escalate even further and go after Chinese companies and banks. Now, that potential is still there. That is, target the Chinese much more aggressively. I wouldn't race to it, because once you start doing that, you start approaching red zones of retaliation and unintended consequences. You may have to. Look, I'm not ruling it out. I tend to be on the push the envelope side. But right now, we have sanctions may have brought us to this moment where there's a direct dialogue. We'll see what happens. It will either work out, in my view, most likely not, and we'll see. And then we may be back to these issues. but I think it's on the table, and the administration, I think, has handled it pretty well, hinting that they were willing to do more, but not rushing to slam the Chinese. I think they've done okay.
I think on the kind of slamming the Chinese part too, you've got to remember something about China, right? So, with respect to North Korea, China is furious, by all accounts, with what the Kim regime has done in trying to develop, test nuclear weapons. All the ballistic missile launches have really pissed off Beijing, right? But from an implementation standpoint of the sanctions, there's UN sanctions that are almost unprecedented in the world. They're spectacularly good. And I think the Trump administration deserves a lot of credit for pushing those in New York. When you come to implementation of those sanctions, I think there's a trick, right? So you've got to look at China. Too many people look at China purely as an adversary in this, and too many folks don't realize, while there may be some pockets within China of areas where, yeah, they might be kind of trying to undercut the sanctions a little bit, China also has implementation issues of its own, right? They have a command economy, but it's not as if they have this regulatory environment that we have here in the United States. I think we make the mistake of projecting our own kind of competence in having OFAC and Andrea's folks being able to enforce against U.S. Financial institutions, exporters, whomever else might be involved, and the competence of our private sector in doing this, and the experience we have in doing this, and assuming that China can just do that because they're China. I think that's a false assumption. And so if you're going to go after the Chinese, I think you really need, especially at any significant level, when you start going after banks, you really need, I think, to have those smoking guns of complicity. And that's something where it's really hard to draw that out. It's hard to get that information. And so, the folks that might be out there saying, well, the only way to fix this is to start whacking Chinese banks. Again, we may get there and we may have to do that, but I think to do that, you really need to have, the top levels of the banks complicit in a conspiracy to undermine the sanctions. I think that's the only way you can really justify that as a legitimate and prudent sanctions action against North Korea.
I think I saw another hand up over here. And if you could please mention your name and affiliation.
Thank you very much. Sorry for my voice, I'm battling a cold. My name is Carlos dos Santos, I'm the ambassador of Mozambique, and I wanted to thank the Council for organizing this very important discussion. The one point I wanted the panel to elaborate on is the multilateral framework for sanctions. Sanctions will always be more effective if you have all countries buying into it and implementing them. But for that, they need to understand them. So when you speak about partners and allies in terms of sanctions, it will be very important to understand that when you are fighting something which is bad for the world, like North Korean regime and the nuclear proliferation, you have more friends than enemies who want to support you in that cause. So I wanted an elaboration of the multilateral framework, UN and beyond.
Ambassador, thank you. That's an excellent question. David?
Sure. We could not agree more. So in this administration, we have focused quite a bit, and not only on the three kind of main regimes we've been talking about, Iran, Russia, North Korea, but also on Venezuela and other sanctions regimes, ISIS, counter-ISIS, and counter-terrorism writ large. We have been focused both in New York, but also building coalitions, regional coalitions, to explain, like you said, explain why we're using sanctions as a tool of foreign policy. What are our end states? Where do we want to go? How is that in our common interests? Like you were saying, it's not only explaining where we're coming from and where we want to go, but it's also explaining how this is in our common interests. And North Korea is a great example, but Iran is another one. And we have been working in the past year to reestablish strong relationships with our Gulf partners, and not only our Gulf partners, but also having those conversations in Europe to talk about our common interests in combating support to Hezbollah, in combating Iran's support to proxies, its destabilizing activity in Yemen, its support to the Assad regime. These are common interests that we share with many partners around the world, and it's building those coalitions to find more leverage and to create force multipliers.
And if I can just add a little bit to what David said, obviously, David is so important, highlighting the importance of multilateral agreement and cooperation, but OFAC is kind of a singular agency worldwide, and it's a domestic implementing agency. I know that our sister components in the Terrorism and Financial Intelligence part of the Treasury Department work very hard to, if there is multilateral will, to try to give the guidance and expertise to make sure there's a way to interdict transactions or take steps that are meaningful and implementable.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Diane Perlman, George Mason School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I think that the point about I think we need to be more complex about it, and as you suggest, it's not only about pressure and coercion, but also diplomacy and other dimensions, and to not just have like one cause that brought them to the table. I mean, there's also the Olympics and some softening and some pride and Moon's work and Pence responding a little bit that led up to this. And also, as you suggested, the fact that they have their own nuclear deterrent, that actually they're probably less dangerous if they feel less insecure. People are more dangerous and they're afraid and they feel like they have some leverage. So it's a few things. And also, I think we need to keep in mind that what Kim Jong-un said about the button was that he didn't intend to use it unless he felt threatened. Now, the media ignored the last part of his statement, and that's a legitimate goal that they have, is to not feel threatened. So I think we need to also temper, like Max, there was also a study of 100 cases of sanctions, and they failed 86 times. So they can break down. So I think along with maximum pressure, we need to consider humiliation, a face-saving way out, drastic tension reduction, and there's an opportunity here, and we need to look at sort of their psychology too. Thank you.
I'll ask if anybody on the panel wants to comment or agree, disagree.
I'll just reiterate, and we've said it, a bunch of us have said it before, sanctions are one tool in the foreign policy toolkit. I don't think any of us on this panel agree that sanctions are a silver bullet or applicable or appropriate for every case. It is one tool, it's a powerful one, but it's in a whole toolbox of tools.
And why don't we take, since I think that counts more as a comment than a question, so I'm going to thank you because that means we get to work in one more question. So if there's another one, I see a hand up.
We, with the Estonian American National Council, and together with my Baltic and Central and East European colleagues, we are on the Hill every week advocating for our policy priorities, and implementation of Russia sanctions is always at the top of that list. I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for how we can best refine our message to appeal to staffers and members of Congress to advance things more effectively.
I have the highest regard for Estonia's ability to resist various forms of Russian aggression. You're on the front line like no kidding. I think that the way to explore is the area to explore is what we've been discussing, is what should be the content of a transatlantic response to Russian political pressure, disinformation, cyber hacking, various forms of non-military pressure on all of us. There is a fertile field, and I found it, I thought it was terrific that Miller's indictment got Prigozhin, right? Just let the record show that we got him first as for a violation of the Ukraine sanctions, but we knew that he was involved we knew at the time that he was involved in funding the St. Petersburg troll farm. There is upside potential. that shouldn't be just American. Now, it may be that the Europeans are not going to be willing to increase sanctions, but I wonder, ask the Brits how they're feeling about the Russians these days, and are they interested in options, or the Spanish, or the French. In my experience, the way you work with Europe is not to ask an abstract question, but assemble a coalition of like-minded people and work with Brussels and be honest about it. Be clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and see what can be done. Either we can have a transatlantic common approach, or second best, you get the Americans with the EU's understanding and some individual governments doing things. Definitely second best. I like working with the EU. But that's where I think that's the direction in which we can go. The Russian economy is stable in a macro sense, but it is in a period of stagnation. And the Russian leadership, Putin, doesn't act like a confident guy. He acts like he's worried about the future of his autocracy, and the power structure around him, if they were really confident, wouldn't be quite so nervous about threats to their money abroad. Again, their anxiety could be our opportunity. They went after us, we should return the favor. Anyway, that's my suggestion. But of course, the Estonian and the Baltic Americans don't need me to tell them that.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. I have one housekeeping announcement, which is that we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then the second panel will begin Uncertainty and Volatility in the Trump Administration Sanctions Policy, the Private Sector's Response, and the Way Forward. Thank you very much to our panelists for an excellent job this morning.
Really happy since there's so many people. We're all people since there's so many people on the panel. Oh yeah. Have separate totals.
I'm sorry?
It's not on NBC.
There were some Russian TV stations.
Oh, I'm sure.
You know,
Is that
right? The Atlantic Council is the favorite Russian think tank. Yeah, they love us.
Yeah. Isn't that funny? Where do you want it?
Unbutton it for me, please. I'm just going to go inside that pocket right there.
Oh, well, then let's do this. So any adjustments after hearing what they said?
No, I don't think so, actually.
That was very praiseworthy. I think you should just start with, okay, any questions?
Yeah, really.
Mr. Shaheen?
Yes.
Right. Unbutton your shirt.
That's why I asked. I recognized it. I went to high school
New York,
in
other places. You can watch it live.
in Los Angeles. But we're spread
Okay,
out.
thank you.
Banking and general compliance. Let me just have one look at
Okay, all right.
You make a grand entrance, is that what they do? Yeah.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Have you met Michael?
So how do you get involved? I was trying to understand.
Michael worked at the Treasury
Oh,
Department.
I
Did a
see,
lot of,
I see.
Was in the Gulf.
Terrorist financing, worked in Qatar, and
Yeah.
all sorts of places.
So it's more from where you come than where you are.
Good morning and welcome to the second session. And we're going to take a tour on the private sector panel on changes in sanctions policy. We've brought together a terrific group with different industry perspectives on shaping and responding to changes in sanctions policy in a global business environment. As you heard in the first panel, sanctions policy is complicated. It is no longer one discipline, but a network of overlapping laws and regulations, whether it's sanctions, export controls, anti-money laundering, and securities regulations. Professionals in this industry must conduct global business operations amid this complexity. My name is Beth Peters. I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells and a co-chair of the International Trade and Investment Practice, and I'm pleased to introduce this panel to you. Michael Greenwald, Senior Vice President, Tiedemann Wealth Management, and also had worked in the Treasury Department, brings a wealth of experience. Richard Svaya, Vice President, National Foreign Trade Council. Fred Shaheen, Chief Counsel, Global Trade, The Boeing Company. And Bob Walsh, Deputy Chief Compliance Officer of the CAATSA Group. We are going to set the context for the continued discussion on the challenging and developing issues of the day. Each person will provide some background on their industry and that industry's focus on particular sanctioned country issues they're facing on a day-to-day basis. And we also want to bring some context here from a U.S. and a non-U.S. point of view, because implementation and response is very challenging depending on where you are located, as the good questions from this morning's panel illustrated. So Michael, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, thank you. It's great to be here, and again, seeing so many old colleagues and friends. In my current position at Tiedemann Wealth Management, I don't work primarily on these issues, but in other work dealing with advising schools or hospitals or institutions, these issues come up all the time. Mm-hmm. And I think whenever an institution is looking to go overseas and to spread its tentacles beyond the United States, there's very little education. And I find that there needs to be a more proactive discussion between what we are talking about here and private industry. Even though there is those discussions taking place, there's not enough. And I think that banks and private institutions need to have the ability to proactively share more information with the government. I think that there needs to be greater education on all sides. I think when we talked about Russia in those sanctions context, the greatest tool from my perspective we had was the uncertainty of the market. The market didn't know what hit them. And I think there continues to be that grayness that allows for there to be more appetite for what's coming next. I think also the role of the Financial Action Task Force, which we haven't touched on yet, in private industry, they're watching it closely. And I think the role FATF plays from a private sector perspective and how it promotes more information sharing will be very important. Thank you.
Richard?
Well, listening to the conversation that preceded this conversation, I was reminded of the father of sanctions ideology, which is Woodrow Wilson. And I used my iPhone to look up the quote that I had forgotten because my memory doesn't work anymore. And the quote is, "A nation that is boycotted is a nation that is in sight of surrender. Apply this economic, peaceful, silent, deadly remedy, and there will be no need for force. It is a terrible remedy. It does not cost a life outside the nation boycotted, but it brings a pressure upon the nation, which in my judgment no modern nation can resist." Now, Wilson said that in the context of the League of Nations, talking about, quote, activity with respect to a rogue nation. i.e. the equivalent, if you will, of the unprecedented UN sanctions on the rogue nation of North Korea. And that reminds me in turn of a kind of hierarchy of sanctions, i.e. at the top of the list, UN authorized, National Security Council approved. If you can't get there, the multilateral sanctions, notably in 2014, which were, I would note, executive in nature, and were done under the stewardship of Ambassador Fried, which is how we met late in your career. And then, of course, if you don't have that, if you don't have multilateral, you have the discovery that was made really when the USA Patriot Act was passed by Stuart Levy, who was the first Undersecretary for Financial Intelligence, and whose fine hand was shown in the conference over CAATSA that took place between the House and the Senate when it came to the financialization of sanctions in the Iran space in 2010. I.e., if you don't have multilateral sanctions, then use the privileged position of the U.S. financial system in the world as the world's and the dollar as the world's reserve currency to, in effect, get the next best thing. And you indirectly alluded to this, Michael, in your remarks about the threat and the uncertainty, and the cloud often carries a force multiplier in terms of the effectiveness of sanctions. Second
only
point,
a certain amount of time.
Time limited. From the point of view of the companies that comprise the National Foreign Trade Council, sanctions are at root in the private sector. They are a responsibility that has to be taken seriously. They are also, let's be clear, an unfunded mandate. We don't get a Treasury Department appropriation to, quote, cover the added cost of compliance, nor cover the market opportunities that are lost as a result of sanctions. Okay. My third point, in terms of pecking order, we've had conversations in the first panel about the role, Liz Rosenberg alluded to this, don't ignore Congress and Congress's role both as a disruptor and an innovator. And that is certainly the case. It was, after all, the original Iran-Libya Sanctions Act that innovated, if you will, the idea of secondary, i.e. extraterritorial sanctions. And passed in the same year that Helms-Burton memorialized as a matter of law what had been the U.S. executive branch embargo on Cuba. So there is this tension, executive and congressional. Again, in terms of a pecking order and the private sector's ability to adapt and to not be surprised and to have constructive conversation in the application of sanctions, executive is better than congressional. And again, Helms-Burton stands as a remarkable testament to this in the sense that, as Ambassador Fried and Andrea indicated, sanctions are at best a tool, and they have to be done in a concerted effort with diplomacy, and if that's going to take place, they have to be adaptive. Now, we've had 50 years of a unilateral embargo of the island, and the result speaks for itself, and we're unable, even with a divided Republican conference politically, we're unable to repeal Helms-Burton. My last point, and this is on the innovative side, and it ties to the Russia space, and Ambassador Fried alluded to this, which is follow the money. If you're dealing with the situation that you're dealing with in the Russia space, which is a huge, and Anders Aslund is in the audience, a compatriot of the ambassadors, a huge amount, non-trivial, in the hundreds of billions of dollars, exported from Russia into safe havens, which happen to be those countries that follow the rule of law, i.e. including, and maybe first among equals, the United States, then you might want to do something in the anti-money laundering front that you haven't done yet. And only Congress can do that, for example, by addressing the issue of beneficial ownership when it comes to shell corporations. I'll stop there.
Fred.
Thanks, Beth. First of all, my thanks to Beth and Andrew Keller and Ambassador Fried for the invitation. It's a great honor for me personally, for the Boeing Company to be here. Having said that, Beth had to catch me trying to exit after that last panel. I just didn't want to follow that act. So, but it's a great pleasure to be here. I am not, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm not a policy person. I'm a practicing attorney. My focus is I'm the trade control guy in the law department for the Boeing Company. And so my world is export-import sanctions. I've been at Boeing 9 years, and prior to that was in private practice, and prior to that in the Navy. But it's just interesting as a data point how much time I spend on sanctions analytical work and interpretive work and sanctions legislation now as compared to just 4 years, 5 years when I first came to Boeing. I would say this is probably the majority of my time spent on either interpretation, because we have a footprint all over the world, as you all know, and not only that, but there's so much going on. I mean, you really just have to keep up, and keeping up not just on the regs, but what's coming down the pike from the Congress. The good news is, in all the time I've been in this business, and it's been a long time, more than I will actually admit in this public space, I've never had a better bunch of government partners than we have. And I call them partners, specifically. Andrea, Peter, Andrew when he was at State Department, Sandra Oudkirk, the list just goes on, both at State and OFAC and other agencies as well, because our position at the company on sanctions, regardless of what sanction program it is that we follow the lead of the U.S. government. This is not something we are interested in being trailblazers on. And so to have the kind of talent, professional talent, I really need to give that shout out, because we couldn't do what we do without them. So I kind of wish Andrew was back there so I could still call him, but now he's just private practice. So last point I'll make, and I'll stop, is again, my perspective is that from the inside of a company, how do you deal with this? And so I want to leave you with one thought as I let my colleague to my left here open his statement, and that is, my challenge is not the U.S. government or the Congress, it's my internal customers, my program guys, my folks that are in the business of selling aircraft or satellites or you name it, and getting them to understand what they can do, what they can't do in a ever-changing, dynamic, regulatory and legislative environment. And so that, I'd be less than honest if I didn't say it was fun, because you say, hey, guess what? There's been a change. You're like, what do you mean there's a change? We just talked about that sanctions program a month ago. I said, well, in my world lately, that's an eternity. So things are moving fast. But I'd like to go back to that theme on how to deal with the business, how to set expectations, and then ultimately with your suppliers and with your customer base around the world. So I'll stop there.
Bob?
Thanks, Beth, and also thanks to the Atlantic Council for having this event. I also found that first panel just really great, and that's the main reason why I'm here, is to have attended the first panel. But I think the reason maybe I was asked to be part of this panel is less to do with what I do in my day job, but I chair an industry group called the Sanctions Roundtable, which is comprised of most of the global insurance sector, plus the Lloyd's market. And so maybe I bring a little perspective about that particular industry. I wanted to start, when I looked at the agenda before coming, it was about this year that's gone by. And I wanted to comment a little bit about, the Washington people that we talked to. The state and OFAC staffers have been great. They've continued to engage with us. They've been professional. They've tried very hard to be helpful. As I'll talk about in a second, I think that maybe there are some new limits on their ability to be helpful, but they've been helpful. I'd like to mention as well, and this is relatively new for our sector, the Hill staff have also, congressional staff have reached out to our sector to try to understand implications. That has different sides to it, but I think that's a positive thing. I will mention as well, and I'm not aware that, I didn't know about this before, but even UN Security Council staff has put together a small group of industry people, including me, to help them understand how do they make their sanctions effective. And so I think those are all positive developments. The other thing I would say is one of the good things about a change in administration is all sorts of really good administration people go to the private sector, and so we can go and talk to them and say, what do we do? And so there really are some good people out there. I wanted to then just make another point about companies, how we look at this whole subject. And the way I think of it is there are two sides. There's the here and now, what can you do today, what can you not do today? And we get a lot of good help on that from advisors. But the other side of it is, where do we want to go and where do we want to be? And for that side of things, there, as Brian O'Toole talked about, others talked about it, there just needs to be a degree of predictability. There are other issues that get in the way. There's, the complexity of sanctions that maybe cause us to back away. There could be conflict of law issues that cause us to back away, particularly if you think about the fact that the global commercial insurance sector, which I think is what we're mainly talking about when we talk about insurance and sanctions, is mostly non-US. And so the complexity of conflict of law issues are important. And to just then talk for a second about predictability, again, this is how I frame it. If I understand correctly, when you think of credit ratings, there are only 2 AAA companies in the United States today. Only 2. And the reason is it's too expensive to be AAA. Well, guess what? Guess how many companies have a AAA compliance program? Like 0. And the reason is it's too expensive. We can't get it all right. So what do? We decide what we're going to get right, and we decide what we're not going to do, and we back away. So the sanctions advisory that just came out regarding North Korea, and I think maybe this is in your question set a little bit, Beth, is excellent. That is one of the best things I've seen as it relates to the insurance sector. And we will do 2 things. We will do new types of due diligence, and we will back away from some activities. And maybe I forget I forget one of the panelists before talked about I forget how they framed it, but sort of intentional disengagement and then sort of unintended consequence. And I think that maybe there are some unintended backing away that will happen in our sector in relation to North Korea. The last thing I wanted to say about predictability was, think about last night's announcement and assume something gets worked out. And we have something like a JCPOA with North Korea. And people from state and Treasury go on a roadshow and say, we want you to engage. Please engage. You know what? We didn't have a very good experience. And those were fantastic people, and in collaboration with the EU people on that roadshow saying, go to it. I think not only do you need partners to make that agreement with North Korea work, it's going to be way more work regarding North Korea to get us to buy in than it was with Iran. Maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, great. So we're going to dig into this a little bit deeper, but we thought we'd see if there was some comments about the difference in engagement. Has your engagement on sanctions policy under the Trump administration as compared to previous administrations changed, or has it been the same on sanctions policy? Michael?
I mean, I think when it comes to this administration, as the previous panel spoke about, you have tremendous professionals who are working on these technocratic issues. And I think what makes this space so special is that for many, many years prior to the Iran deal, it was truly non-political. And you saw the votes in Congress, and they were hugely bipartisan. Right. So I think when it comes to how this administration is cooperating with private industry, it's very proactive. I think there's more of it. And I think this administration is actually bringing in private sector even more to have those conversations. So from my experience, having recently left, it's been quite positive.
Good. Does anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm sitting here thinking that I think our first engagements on the JCPOA, actually it was the JPOA initially, right. 3.5 years ago, roughly, and different administration. I think two things. Number one, a lot of the professionals are still the same. That's number one. So so they were great before, great now. But I do think on a lot of new issues like CATSA, the reach out to industry has been terrific. I think it's been it's interesting. I have young lawyers who work for me who think it was always like this. And I go back to the days, some of you can remember, some of my generation, when this kind of ability to reach in and get a meeting, and not just if you're a big OEM like we are, but for anybody, to go in and get a meeting with OFAC or get a meeting, 10, 15 years ago, wasn't quite so easy. So yeah, I think it's great, and it's been pretty consistent with this new administration as well.
Great. So the impact of, Bob, did you want to make a comment? Or Richard?
I was just going to reiterate, in terms of, and we can be specific, in terms of the people who are left at state, and in terms of Treasury, both political and career, the level of effective communication is undiminished. I can't say that in terms of other parts of the executive branch. In terms of Congress, Congress is a steady state. I mean, you just have to keep up with who's doing what in terms of the committee staff and the individual members as they take on responsibilities. But that's steady state and undiminished.
Great. So now I want to turn to another area of global trade and investment. Obviously, sanctions makes this very complicated. You have certain partners who are not using U.S. origin goods, software, technology, are not trying to use U.S. dollar denominated transactions, and this is leading to trends of de-risking, and wanted you all to make some commentary. I mean, Bob, do you want to go first in that regard?
Yeah, and this is something that we've had lots of discussions with staff, not just in the last year, but before, at State, at Treasury, and I think even the Hill staffers when we've talked to them. If you look at the global marine insurance industry in parts of the world where those transactions used to be in dollars, increasingly or to a material extent, we're seeing other currencies biting into that. And not just for payments, but actually denomination. And once we create the capability to do that business in other currencies, why would you go back? And I don't say that cynically. I just think it's probably of lower risk. So I think that's one tangible example of de-risking. And I think, to be blunt, there is geographic de-risking, and that doesn't necessarily just mean countries. It can mean certain territorial waters in certain other areas as well.
Michael?
Sure. I returned over the summer from the Gulf, and I saw it firsthand, institutions and parts of the country that want to work with U.S. banks. They want to work with U.S. institutions, but because there are still stigmas, they can't. And I think once they leave the banks and they go to the informal sector, it becomes a true vulnerability. And so I think we need to continue to have more correspondent banking conversations. I know that has been taking place for the last several years. But it's truly a risk once it does become informal. And I don't think we have been able to gotten our hands around yet how to combat the informal sector and to bring them into the fold.
Right. So another issue that's come up about business is obviously predictability and lack of being able to plan. And so sanctions, as you know, can target a country, a territory, an industry practice, and also designate individuals and companies, regardless of location, without advance notification. How do your industries address this complexity and work to shape the interpretation of sanctions so that you can do business the next day and meet your global needs? Richard, you want to take that
first?
Well,
we've had some discussion of the difference between executive-initiated sanctions and congressional initiated. Right. And we had a case study in what you're indirectly alluding to with the passage of CATSA last summer, where, not to get into the weeds, but there had been a process underway within the confines of the Senate Banking Committee, which has primary jurisdiction, to craft a deliberative, and I'll use conservative, in the small c sense of the word, Russia sanctions bill. When the Iran sanctions bill, which had received equally careful vetting in Senate Foreign Relations, reached the floor, then all bets were off in the Russia space. And in the space of 2 days, you had that 98-2 vote on something that was patched together by principals shooing staff away, and you had then frankly, something that fit Oliver Holmes's admonition that bad cases make bad law. That being said, it then moved to implementation. And that's when the professionals, if you will, without gilding the lily, stood themselves proud. And when I'm talking about the professionals, I'm talking about Treasury, OFAC, State Department, Commerce, that had to come out with guidance in terms of implementation. And the level of interaction with the affected business community was unprecedented, and it was constructive. And I think it has shown to date. Section 241 notwithstanding, but then again, that comes back to my little curiosity about follow the money.
Beth, if I could add, it's an interesting discussion. I would say from, the group that I work with, that we actually are quite afraid of congressional sanctions, and for different reasons. But we can get into that. I wanted to really make another comment. On May 12th, if the waivers aren't signed, I'm already hearing suggestions that some European governments are going to be pushing European headquartered organizations. You are going to stay engaged with Iran, and that's going to place us in an impossible position. And Ambassador Fried talked about an aggressive use of this, but there's a point when we start to create damage to the tool. It strikes me. I mean, I'm not a State Department policy person, but in that way, or if, for example, other superpowers start to use secondary sanctions as a policy tool, it is like a trade war, it seems to me. So just planning in that type of a context sounds hard.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Again, back down to the deck plates where I operate, and that is, there's risk as a prime contractor. There's risk as a supplier. There's risk as a financial institution who wants to do business with us. So sanctions related transactions, or perhaps a transaction that needs some authorization. You pick the example. If you're the holder of the license and it's for a period of X years, and usually 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, whatever, and you're dealing with a supply base, or you're dealing with a bank, or you're dealing with whatever, and they say, well, okay, what's the life of this deal? You go, well, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And the question is, at the most basic level, is, hey, big company, how are you going to cover my risk, because you can't guarantee me you're going to get a renewal of that license when it comes due, in 3 years from now or 2 years from now. And think about this. I mean that's true in the export world. It's a general matter, but in the sanctions world, it's even more acute, because these are such highly sensitive political issues. So that then leads us to the as the company, as the manufacturer, into the unenviable position of trying to convince third parties, yeah, come along for the ride. I need you. I need the thing you make for the thing I make, or I need your bank to move money from point A to point B. And the response is, I don't know. It's kind of like, what? And so in a lot of cases, the reaction from the lawyers on the other side is they hire very smart people to come up with terms and conditions where I take the risk. And so I'm taking the risk as the manufacturer that if this license, this authorization is not renewed on a sanctioned related transaction, that I'm on the hook, and that's very difficult. So when it comes to uncertainty, I don't know what the workaround is. It's unrealistic to expect any administration to give you a license for multiple years, like you would perhaps a technical assistance agreement from the State Department on something that's not sanction related. But this is the challenge that I face every day as the in-house counsel, and I don't see this getting any better. Quite honestly, it's a challenge.
So let's turn a little bit to the Hill. Is the business community given the importance of support that President Trump will need to come up with a solution to continue to renew the waivers on the nuclear sanctions? Can each of you comment on activity, and maybe Richard, start off about what your group might be doing in terms of outreach and supporting your members?
Well, business is not about setting policy. That said, given the terms and conditions that were articulated in the JCPOA, when there was never a hope for the removal of primary sanctions on US-based entities, not a hope. We have an interest in Congress being successful in preserving what has been achieved. A. B, you have to watch the space in any case, because Russia hasn't gone away. And the pressure for replaying what occurred in 2017, when the Iran/North Korea, well, North Korea wasn't part of it then, till it hit the floor. When the Iran bill was brought to the floor, the pressure for another Russia bill, congressionally legislated, hasn't gone away. So, political outlook for what it's worth, watch that space.
Michael?
I just think we have to be very thoughtful and be careful about the use of sanctions, as the previous panel said, when it comes to how we are deploying it and how much we are deploying it. the Russia sanctions was a special time because of the nature of the debt and equity restrictions, and that was done very thoughtfully. And I think from the business side, I think there needs to be more of a conversation about what are the economic consequences for business, because we want a strong economy, we want businesses to continue to grow, but they do have some, consequences that people on the Hill may not realize are actually taking place. So it's a delicate balance between the two.
Beth, could I add, to Richard's comment about, on the private sector, our job is not policy. Of course, companies get involved in discussions. Our discussions with the Hill, which I think have been quite constructive, have been to try to make sure they understand nuances of our sector and what the ramifications are of those nuances. And I think that matters a lot when I think of the first panel and talking about the increased complexity and targeting of sanctions. Sanctions have come of age. And I think there's every possibility that last night's announcement will be, if it's, there's a degree of success, it will be attributed to sanctions, and therefore we'll see more of this. And I think it behooves industry sectors to make sure that the people who are developing those sanctions understand the nuances of your industry, because we have a common interest in those sanctions achieving their ends and not having adverse unintended consequences.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I just echo what Robert said. The engagement with the Congress has been very constructive and has been for years. Several of the folks we deal with are in the audience today. I want to piggyback on what Robert said about understanding the industry. When we first engaged on the JCPOA, we had multiple conversations with Andrew and others at State and at Treasury about how you build and sell commercial airplanes. There was a real education that had to go on that you couldn't expect anybody to know that if you weren't in the industry. Same with the Russia sanctions, talking to folks on the Hill, trying to explain to them, what would be impacted. Have you thought about this? Did you even know about what we do there or what our industry does in that sector or that sector? So that's a good thing. And I see more of that than less of it. And so I think if there is a thematic, and we heard it in the first panel from Peter and others, is, I don't think anyone, either the drafters on the Hill or in the administration or certainly in industry, want unintended consequences, but we in industry take seriously our role, however small or large, in helping that not happen, and that means constant, continual, constructive interaction with the drafters, whoever the drafters are, whether it's at OFAC or whether it's on a committee in the Senate, or it's just so instrumental. And my last comment is, I've never seen it better or more robust. And so I sure hope that as we go forward, whatever, that's the new normal. And I see that this administration sort of taking that approach.
Yeah.
But could I add one more comment about that, which is, I agree, and yet to the extent sanctions have come of age, the approach remains ad hoc today, the way that industry is engaged with. There's a decision to make, we're going to have outreach, and I think maybe there needs to be something more than ad hoc to ensure if sanctions will become even used to a greater extent, and when we're dealing with major economies, major economies that are being sanctioned, they're going to be highly targeted, to have something maybe a little more systematic. Or maybe it exists and I'm unaware, I'm not invited to the table. But the point is, I think there needs to be something more systematic to ensure that such new things continue to
And I think that's
achieve what you said.
a particularly good point on engagement, because these companies and the business community now is global. There really are no borders. And one of the issues, whether it's different forms of sanctions now are trickling down to forced labor prohibitions on imports, on conflict minerals, on your supply chain, on who your business partners are, beneficial ownership, have you done screening? Do you want to comment on your industry dealing with U.S. and non-U.S. supply chain and business partner issues related to sanctions risk? Fred, you want to maybe take that one first?
Yeah, sure. So let's do the supply chain first. Any given product may have 8,000 different suppliers at various levels, okay? And there's a tension here, right? Well, I talked about risk and risk allocation earlier, so I'm not going to revisit that. But just on education, I mean, we have a huge infrastructure, a compliance infrastructure at Boeing. You know, we have 200 people that do trade controls, just trade controls, plus, you know, I mean, you know, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting somebody in the compliance organization. But that's good, and that's true of a lot of the big aerospace companies and defense companies. How about the ones that don't, the companies, the supplier at the first or second or even third tier, who don't have the resources to have that kind of resource? So what do? They have a tendency to look to us for legal advice. Now, they don't ask for it in that way. They don't say, hey, you know, they're not talking to the law department, they're talking to our purchasing organ, you know, our supply organization that's looking for the best price for the best item, whatever that happens to be. And they'll say, well, is this going to go into an airplane that's going to Russia? Is that a problem to a Russian airline? Just as an example. And so they want us to basically advise them. And I said there's a tension there. We view our suppliers as partners. I think that's the right approach. But at the end of the day, last I checked, there is almost no shortage of attorneys available in the United States to be hired to go do this. So at some point, you know, they need, and we tactfully let them know they need to get their own counsel. We'll always tell them, and I pride myself on this. We are not the kind of company, if you ask us what our position is on a given regulatory issue, we will tell you. You may or may not agree with that, but at the end of the day, it's up to you as that supplier, particularly in something as volatile, as quickly changing, as nuanced as sanctions-related activities. So, point one, they've got to do their own homework. Point two, we have to find the right line on how much we can help with that, point them in the right direction, and somewhere in there is the right formula. The formula for us may not be the formula for your company, or one size does not fit all, but I think the concept does fit all, is you've got to be partners with your supply chain. And then if you have a difference of agreement, if you just can't get to where you both want to be, then there are a number of options, including going to the regulator to adjudicate that, and they've been pretty helpful when that happens.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments? Bob.
In my sector, we don't really. Is this on? I don't really have the supply chain issues, but there are solvable inefficiencies in how industry complies with sanctions. And again, if sanctions have come of age, I think there's just an opportunity to think about it. So I'll use an example that is relevant to my world. In fact, this is all day, every day. When Boeing, you know, gets its master insurance policies around the world, there will be 10 or more insurance companies on that syndicate. It's always been the case. We all have to do our sanctions compliance. We don't rely on Boeing. We don't rely on each other. We don't rely on the broker. And you know what? Sometimes it's not worth the trouble. And so we disengage. And I'm not recommending a reliance regime. We are actually having this discussion at the FATF level now.
Right.
There's sort of a review of the insurance sector at FATF. But I just think that there's room for maybe some room for original thinking about what are some ways of approaching this, which will allow the good business to happen without de-risking where we don't really want it to happen.
Great. Well, thank you. And now we want to open it up for Q&A. If you could say your name and affiliation, and the mic right over here is a question.
Thanks, Beth, and to the Atlantic Council. Great panel. One comment and then a quick question. It just seems to me, having worked up in the Congress and then worked the Congress for a long time, we're about one indictment plus one administration sort of misstep on Russia sanctions from another very serious effort to push Russia sanctions through the Congress. And so that's how I sort of see it. So if you have any reaction to that. But I'm also interested in whether you all are tracking Venezuela sanctions. It seems like that was a skillful deployment in August of a series of financial sanctions. And now I see the Secretary of State is talking about oil sanctions. And to me, the policy lessons over and over that policymakers who may not be sanctions types are drawing is that sanctions are very, very effective and let's do more, not less. So interested in your Venezuela comments especially.
Well, Venezuela is a rock and a hard place. There has been no ability in terms of the diplomatic engagement regionally and globally. There has been no ability to get a dialogue going between the admittedly fractured opposition and the increasingly isolated regime. Meanwhile, the country is approaching hyperinflation, and the human cost, as documented in the New York Times severally, is incalculable. That being said, how do you change the status quo? So that's why the Secretary puts energy sanctions on the table in terms of the U.S., because uniquely it is only U.S. downstream that pays full price for the Venezuelan basket, that the diminishing exportable basket, which is the only supply of cash to the country. If you were to shut that off, if you were to take that draconian measure, what happens within the country? Can anybody game that out?
Michael?
I think the sanctions on Venezuela have been targeted, and I think they're starting to really be effective. And I think the administration's been quite creative with regards to what they're doing in Venezuela. I would expect to see more with regards to that. One thing we haven't touched on, and I'm not saying in this case, is the use of Section 311 of the Patriot Act. I think it's a very effective tool. I think that changes behavior immediately, and it puts institutions and jurisdictions on notice like never before seen. So I think the administration's use of that tool going forward will be very important to watch.
Beth, could I add, just regarding Russia and Venezuela, I would say it's my sense from my sector that some targeted sanctions aren't that hard for industry, and some targeted sanctions are very, very hard. And they, from a policymaker point of view, and even from a net effect point of view, it may amount to the same thing, but there are reasons why it's wiser to use targeted sanctions that are easier. So I would say, for example, the Venezuela debt and equity sanctions haven't been, and I have colleagues who would like to punch me in the nose for saying it, but I would say that they've not been so terribly difficult, and maybe that's a tool, sort of that side of the balance sheet, that would be good going forward.
Another question? Yeah.
Hi, Liz Rosenberg again. Thanks for your comments. Would you all talk a little bit about what you see amongst your clients and members, or other anecdotes from industry about how companies are looking forward to the May deadlines for rollover of the waivers giving relief to foreign businesses doing work in Iran pursuant to the JCPOA. What kinds of hedging or risk management practices do you see going on? How is banking changing? What about people who are doing oil trade and refiners, European refiners specifically? How are they thinking about what happens in a day after scenario?
Well, they're all looking at their language and their agreements if they forgot to look at that the first time. And they are certainly in active dialogue with their business communities within their supply chain and trying to understand and confirm whether there's U.S. content, how U.S. law applies. And some people are very happy they never engaged in the first place and de-risked themselves, and others are hoping for the best, embracing for the worst. You guys want to speak out from different industry point of views?
I'll just say one thing. I think the precedent that's going to be set, how we handle the waiver and what happens in May and going forward, and how thoughtfully or not we're using this tool, industry and the world is watching. And I think that's something to keep in mind each time and again is what type of example are we making?
Mm-hmm.
I'll only add at the operational level, and now I'm talking about non-U.S. based entities that have a significant U.S. presence. The cost benefit is simple and brutal.
And I've had conversations about with some people in this room. This is really important for the insurance sector, and even more important for their client base, obviously. But one thing is, I guess, whether the guidance around a snapback applies, or we can assume it would apply, or that we would get guidance saying, yeah, that's a reasonable set of assumptions in that scenario. And I don't know if Andrea is here.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that something you could talk about a little bit? Okay.
You're good.
Okay.
But snapback, right.
Yeah.
Fred, do you want to make a last comment?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously, I can't talk about specific contingency plans or anything at the company, but it's a great question, Liz. It's maybe the question. I hate to, just beat the drum, but we're going to follow the lead of the U.S. government. What the U.S. government decides, that's how we're going to comport ourselves, because at the end of the day, that's how we've done it up till now for the last 2.5, 3 years in the Iran deal. That's how we will continue to do it. And I'll be honest with you, I'm relatively confident, given the level of detailed guidance that's come out of OFAC, that's come out of state, and the engagement we've had. I'm relatively confident that we will get the guidance we need to, do whatever is necessary based on the May 5th decision, or after. So, yeah, it's uncertainty in the business world. We don't like uncertainty, but all things considered, we're prepared for whatever happens, and we know our partners in the government, are going to help us get through those wickets.
Any other questions for the panel? I think we had in closing, I think some of the biggest uncertainty certainly is on the JCPOA and whether waivers will be issued. We also talked a little bit about China and designations there and how that affects the global economy. But does anyone else want to make some final parting words? Michael?
I think on China, the Daidong Bank and that example is something really, I think, targeted, and I think the administration deserves credit for that, because that was a very important step. And so I think taking a targeted approach, and I think it really, if you look at what we've done in the Russia casebook, that is something that they're going to continue to turn back to. But I think that the China example is something really important.
Great. Well, I want to thank the panel, and from an administrative point of view, if everyone could please stay seated, Ambassador Fried is going to come to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker. So thank you.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Undersecretary Mandelker, the senior sanctions person in the U.S. government, someone who has the good luck to be in charge of a deeply competent organization or sets of organizations in Treasury, and the bad luck to be saddled with an issue where no matter how well they do, it'll never satisfy everybody. So that's just life. She is exceptionally qualified. Southern District, New York Attorney's Office, Counselor to DHS Secretary, Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and lots more. But she has one other qualification, which I want to emphasize. I suspect that Undersecretary Mandelker knows that public policy counts. Not inside the Washington Beltway, not in terms of reputation, influence, position, the next job, but counts for people. When you get it right, millions of people benefit. And when policy goes wrong, people end up in bad places or dead. Lots of them, and real fast. And I suspect she understands that, which is the essential ingredient to differentiate someone who simply does a job and someone who helps change the world. And that's what public policy can be about. So with that, and my appreciation for coming, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. Really, thank you. That's one of the kindest and most meaningful introductions I've ever received, so I greatly appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me to speak. As many of you know, the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, or TFI, is a close-knit family, and it's always terrific to speak at an event with so many Treasury alumni. I'm going to start today with a bit of a history lesson. It's a history that I learned in my early months as Undersecretary. It is part of the fabric of our organization, and it has helped shape the framework under which I view our mission and the way in which we execute that mission. It starts in 1940. During World War II, a small group of very smart professionals at Treasury, led by John Paley and under the direction of then Secretary Henry Morgenthau, recognized that they could use economic authorities under the Trading with the Enemy Act to prevent Nazis from seizing U.S.-held assets of countries that the Nazis were invading. And so they set up an administrative agency called the Office of Foreign Funds Control, following the issuance of an executive order that prohibited financial transactions related to countries that Germany occupied. The Treasury Department back then required financial institutions to freeze those assets to ensure that these funds didn't fall into Nazi hands. They were able to seize and freeze billions of dollars, including in a number of dramatic ways. This was the predecessor agency to what we now know as the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. But the Treasury Department didn't stop there. In 1943, after learning that Jewish children were in hiding in Nazi-occupied Europe, that same group of professionals resolved to find a way to use their authorities to help save those Jewish children. They were asked by the World Jewish Congress to issue a license to authorize that funds be made available to, among other things, help Jewish children escape Nazi-controlled Europe. They worked for months to secure this authorization and enable the funds to be released to support this effort, overcoming significant obstacles within the U.S. government to do so. Having learned through this work about the atrocities that were happening in Europe, Secretary Morgenthau, John Paley, and others believed that the U.S. government should do much more to save the Jews of Europe. And so in late 1943 and early 1944, they pushed for the establishment of the War Refugee Board. This board was led by John Paley and other members of the Treasury team, and played an instrumental role in saving the lives of thousands of Holocaust survivors in the final years of World War II, including through work with Raoul Wallenberg. At the very same time that these efforts were underway at the Treasury Department, my parents were Jewish children hiding in Europe. They were hiding underground, in the forest, in haystacks, and they were also hidden by courageous individuals who risked their own lives to save my parents and others. That my parents survived is literally nothing more or nothing short of a miracle. To learn that there was a group in the Treasury Department, in the office that I now oversee, working steadily to use the government's economic authorities to save Jewish children in hiding and others is truly remarkable and incredibly humbling. The work of Secretary Morgenthau, John Paley, and others at the Treasury Department during World War II provides the framework under which I view our role at TFI today. They recognized in the 1940s that the Treasury Department had unique economic authorities that they could deploy in a variety of ways, and they worked steadily, strategically, smartly to figure out how to use those authorities in the most impactful ways. That is an important element of the approach that we are employing today, but with much more robust tools. TFI's components today include OFAC, FinCEN, the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, and the Treasury Executive Office for Asset Forfeiture. Within the components of TFI, we have a broad array of economic authorities and tools across a wide spectrum, including sanctions, including USA Patriot Act authorities like Sections 311 and 314A and B, enforcement, international engagement, policy, intelligence and analysis, and other regulatory authorities. I view TFI's authorities as operating as part of one continuum. For every problem that we face, whether it's terrorist financing, proliferation financing, drug trafficking, human rights abuses, corruption, and others, we are strategically deploying and integrating those tools best suited to the problem and in complementary ways. TFI is the only office of its type in the world that combines such a broad array of economic tools and components. I always say that Congress and the executive branch acted with tremendous vision in 2004 when they put TFI's components under one roof. This was truly a revolutionary development in the national security arena. Counterterrorism and national security had traditionally been in the realms of foreign affairs, defense, intelligence, and law enforcement. Treasury's authorities were brought together under one simple concept: bad actors cannot operate without funding. And so just as Secretary Morgenthau and John Paley did so many years ago, after 9/11, TFI set off to cut the terrorist access from the U.S. financial system by deploying new tools, as well as long-held authorities with a renewed energy, and strategic outlook. Today, to counter the threats that we face across the globe, from murderous dictators preying on their own citizens, weapons proliferators like Kim Jong-un threatening the United States and our allies, terrorists murdering the innocent to sow instability, and others, we work steadily to assess and analyze each threat. We use intelligence and other information and employ a range of tools in innovative ways, constantly adapting to ensure that they are properly synchronized and calibrated to bring maximum economic leverage to bear. And we also collaborate closely with our partners in the interagency, with Congress, with allies across the world, and with the private sector to amplify our actions in a number of different ways. To further promote this integration and find new ways to pressure our adversaries, we are also standing up new strategic impact units, or SIUs, within Treasury's existing structure. These SIUs will bring together individuals representing TFI's components to further develop innovative strategies for using our economic authorities. The SIUs will focus on particular threats and systemic risks. These SIUs will harness years of deep expertise in complex issue areas, and working together, they will review, analyze, and recommend strategies to further calibrate our economic authorities. And they will regularly assess the effects of our actions to continually sharpen our efforts and our tactics. The integrated use of our authorities must be part of a broader strategic plan. As I have said a number of times, sanctions alone are not a foreign policy. Sanctions are a tool among our many authorities that we use to achieve particular objectives. They are part of the interagency strategies that include our other economic authorities, diplomacy, intelligence, law enforcement, and our other elements of national power. Let me give you a few examples of how we are using our authorities in innovative and integrated ways to address the challenges that we face. I'm going to start with North Korea. The North Koreans told our South Korean ally that they will refrain from testing more missiles and nuclear weapons and that they are willing to denuclearize. They have made such promises in the past, but we will have the chance to test their sincerity now that President Trump has accepted an invitation to meet the North Korean leader. It's clear that our maximum pressure campaign has brought us to this juncture. North Korea poses an urgent threat for which we are using the entire arsenal of our economic authorities. For years, the Kim regime built up its nuclear and ballistic missile programs with little global oversight. North Korea has been launching missiles over our allies and territories and has boasted that its weapons of mass destruction can reach American cities. Inside North Korea, the Kim regime has developed a brutal state apparatus to coerce, control, and punish ordinary citizens and any who might contemplate dissent. It is estimated that tens of thousands of political prisoners are detained in an elaborate network of prison camps, just one of which is 3 times the size of Washington, D.C. According to the United Nations, inmates in these camps have been subject to deliberate starvation, forced labor, executions, torture, rape, and forced abortions. When facing a regime and leaders who prioritize power over people, we have brought all of our economic authorities to bear to change their calculus and siphon off the funds that enable them to continue to proliferate. We cannot tolerate the threat that this regime, armed with nuclear weapons, poses to the citizens of the world. And together with our allies, we have been intensifying our maximum economic pressure campaign until North Korea achieves complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. Just 2 weeks ago, we announced the largest sanctions package ever in the North Korea program. As part of this package, we designated 1 individual, 27 entities, and 28 vessels abroad vessels located, registered, or flagged in countries across the globe. We coupled this action with other TFI tools to achieve maximum effect. On that same day, Ambassador Haley nominated these vessels to be listed at the UN. We also issued a global shipping advisory along with our colleagues in the State Department and the U.S. Coast Guard, highlighting to the world North Korea's deceptive shipping practices. After our designations, I met with representatives from jurisdictions of those designated entities to urge them to take swift action against those entities to the extent they had not already done so. And we are synchronizing our actions in these and other ways with our interagency partners to maximize the impact of these crucial economic authorities. These actions have built on our full-court effort to maximize pressure on the Kim regime. Over the last year, in addition to tough UN Security Council resolutions, Treasury has designated over 200 individuals and entities in connection with the North Korea threat. We have amplified this pressure in multiple other ways. This includes the actions we have brought under FinCEN's Section 311 authority under the USA Patriot Act, including cutting off a Chinese bank from the U.S. financial system when we found it to be a primary money laundering concern for facilitating North Korean money laundering and sanctions evasion. Just a few weeks ago, we again used this authority to identify a Latvian bank that had, among other things, processed transactions for parties connected to North Korea as a primary money laundering concern and to propose similar restrictions. We have also enlisted the private sector in this fight, providing information to financial institutions to highlight how North Korea disguises, moves, and launders funds to finance its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. And I have also conducted a number of private sector roundtables, including in my recent travels to Asia and Europe, where I tell financial institutions that they need to be extraordinarily vigilant to make sure North Korea is not moving money through their banks. We also work closely through the UN, G7, and the FATF to encourage strict implementation and compliance standards for counter-proliferation financing. While our sanctions, 311 actions, advisories, and extensive outreach are each powerful, by bringing them all to bear on the Kim regime, we magnify the impact of our pressure campaign, and it is starting to have an impact. Turning to Iran. In Iran, the regime and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has spread its tentacles across the Middle East. They promote instability in Syria and support murderous President Bashar al-Assad. The IRGC and its Quds Force contribute to violence and instability in Yemen by sending military equipment to the Houthis and have engaged in a large-scale counterfeiting scheme. The IRGC provides upwards of $700 million a year to Hezbollah, which continues to threaten our close ally Israel, including using rockets supplied by Iran to target Israeli cities. At the same time, the Iranian regime brutally suppresses legitimate public dissent at home. Over the last couple of months, Iranian citizens have taken to the streets, loudly shouting that they have had enough of the regime's corruption and financial support for foreign proxies. Many have done so at grave risk to their own lives, as the regime has thrown protesters in jail, violently censored its people who seek to freely protest, and much worse. Under this administration, we have designated targets in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe in connection with the IRGC and Iran's support for terrorism, ballistic missile programs, human rights abuses, censorship, cyber attacks, and transnational criminal activity. To push back on Iran's malign activities, we magnify our powerful sanctions with our international engagement and clear messaging to the private sector. There is no transparency to speak of in Iran, and there are massive deficiencies in their anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism regime. The IRGC has an extensive presence in Iran's economy, which is obscured by this lack of transparency. In our engagements both here in the United States and abroad, we have made clear that companies doing business in Iran face substantial risks, and we will hold those knowingly doing business with the IRGC and others that finance the regime's malign activities to account. For over a decade, the FATF has highlighted the terrorist financing risk emanating from Iran and the threat that it poses to the international financial system. A threat so significant that countermeasures were imposed, although suspended in 2016 when Iran committed to an action plan with the FATF to address its significant AML-CFT deficiencies. At the same time, Iran remained on the FATF's blacklist. Just 2 weeks ago, the FATF concluded that Iran had failed to fulfill its commitment to the FATF to implement its action plan. The FATF has made clear that the onus of responsibility falls upon Iran, and it specifically called out Iran for failing to address the majority of its AML-CFT action plan requirements. For the first time ever in a public statement, the FATF provided a comprehensive list of Iran's major deficiencies, highlighting its terrorist financing risk and reiterating the threat this poses to the international system. The FATF made clear that appropriate measures need to be passed and implemented. We are also very focused on pressuring Russia for its continued efforts to destabilize Ukraine, occupy Crimea, meddle in elections, as well as for its endemic corruption and human rights abuses. To date, this administration has sanctioned 100 individuals and entities under our Ukraine and Russia-related sanctions authorities. These designations are in addition to our other efforts to hold Russia accountable for its actions, including our sanctioning of Russians targeted for activities related to the North Korea sanctions program, our Global Magnitsky program, and the Sergei Magnitsky Act. Most recently, on January 26, 2018, we sanctioned 42 individuals and entities related to Russia and Ukraine, including a number who helped Russia transfer turbines to Crimea in clear violation of our sanctions. The following week, we submitted a report to Congress under Section 241 of CATSA on senior political figures and oligarchs in the Russian Federation. This extensive report, which was coordinated very closely with the intelligence community, including our Office of Intelligence and Analysis, contained an extremely thorough analysis that is being used to inform future targeted sanctions. We have taken other vigorous steps to implement CATSA. During the fall of 2017, Treasury amended and reissued Directives 1, 2, and 4 of the sectoral sanctions, further tightening our restrictions on key Russian industries such as energy and finance. Our targeting of Russian companies that do business with rogue regimes around the world includes the OFAC-designated Independent Petroleum Company, a Russian company that signed a contract to provide oil to North Korea and reportedly shipped petroleum products to North Korea, as well as other companies engaged in sanctionable activity related to North Korea. And we are calling on Russia to expel the North Korean financial and trade representatives that reside in their country, as they are required to do under UN Security Council resolutions. The administration also recently issued a public attribution of the NotPetya attack to the Russian military. These actions build on our whole-of-government efforts to counter Russia's aggression. Venezuela. In Venezuela, the Maduro regime has continued to undermine democracy, impoverish its citizens, and loot the country to line its pockets. The Maduro regime's assault on democracy, combined with its irresponsible economic policies, have had a devastating impact on Venezuela. Essential goods such as food, medicine, have become increasingly scarce. Food scarcity is no accident. The Maduro regime uses food as a weapon and to enrich itself while refusing to allow humanitarian assistance into the country. He is a dictator who once again prioritizes power over people. To counter Maduro's continued assault on democracy and his own people, we are using our sanctions authorities to target those in the regime responsible for the country's dire economic, social, and political situation, as well as those engaging in illicit activities. On Secretary Mnuchin's first day in office, he announced the designation of Venezuela's executive vice president, Tariq el-Assami, for playing a significant role in international narcotics trafficking, and the designation of his frontman, Samark Lopez Bello, for assisting el-Assami. Their designation disrupted their ability to launder illicit proceeds, and hundreds of millions of dollars in assets associated with Lopez Bello have since been blocked. Since then, we have sanctioned 44 more current and former government of Venezuela officials, including Maduro himself. Most recently, we announced the designation of 4 senior military officers on January 5, 2018. We amplified this pressure through a powerful executive order the President issued in August 2017 that denies the regime critical sources of financing and protects the U.S. financial system. This executive order limits the ability of the government and its companies, including in the energy sector, to secure financing from international markets. It also cuts the regime off from important revenue streams. In September 2017, another amplifying action, FinCEN issued an advisory to alert financial institutions of widespread public corruption in Venezuela and the methods that senior political figures and their associates may use to move and hide proceeds of their corruption, at the grave expense, again, of the Venezuelan people. Combined with our powerful targeted sanctions and other public messaging, this advisory put financial institutions on watch for possible illicit fund flows. At the same time that we are taking action through our economic authorities, we are also working with our international partners to bring additional pressure, including through multilateral sanctions on the regime. Turning to global corruption and other global corruption and human rights abuses. In too many countries across the world, innocents live under fear of arbitrary kidnapping and imprisonment, deprivation and starvation, forced labor and torture, and even execution. Corrupt political leaders and their families embezzle their country's wealth at the expense of their citizens. And illicit traffickers prey upon innocent people, selling them into slavery or the sex trade, and even exploiting them for their organs. Such serious human rights abuses and endemic public corruption undermine the foundation of stable, secure, and functioning societies. They devastate individuals, weaken democratic institutions, and degrade the rule of law. They perpetuate violent conflict and undermine economic markets. And they threaten the integrity of the U.S. and international financial system. This administration is undertaking a campaign against those who prey on the vulnerable and violate the inalienable rights of their citizens. We are imposing financial consequences on those who pillage the wealth and resources of their people and generate ill-gotten profits from corruption, cronyism, and criminal activity. In December 2017, President Trump signed an executive order implementing the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, authorizing sanctions on persons involved or complicit in serious human rights abuses or corruption across the world. As part of that announcement, this administration imposed sanctions on 52 individuals and entities. They include billionaire Dan Gertler, who amassed his fortune through hundreds of millions of dollars worth of opaque and corrupt mining and oil deals in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Roberto Jose Rivas Reyes, who was president of Nicaragua's Supreme Electoral Council, has been accused of amassing sizable personal wealth and has been described by a Nicaraguan comptroller general as above the law. And Burmese army official Maung Maung So, who oversaw military actions against the Rohingya, where widespread extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, and arbitrary arrests were alleged to have taken place. Treasury's designations send a powerful message to those who flagrantly abuse human rights or line their pockets with riches at the expense of the innocent. Human rights abusers and the corrupt are on notice. We are watching, and we will take action. These designations are about impact. These sanctions have directly affected the ability of these corrupt individuals to access their funds. We couple these efforts to combat human rights abusers and the corrupt with our other authorities. Just as an example, FinCEN issued an advisory in September 2017 alongside our sanctions, alerting U.S. financial institutions to the potential exposure to AML risks caused by South Sudanese senior political figures. We also seek to bolster the impact of our actions through coordination with our international partners. For example, the EU imposed sanctions on many of the same individuals we have targeted in South Sudan, the DRC, and elsewhere. And we are now working with the EU and other like-minded partners to encourage them to develop similar authorities of their own. Additionally, we conduct extensive outreach to our international partners following the publication of Treasury actions. Just as an example, after the September 2017 actions against South Sudanese senior political figures, we immediately engaged with neighboring governments, asking them to investigate the illicit financial flows from these senior political figures into their countries, and to similarly conduct outreach to the private sector to counter corruption by South Sudanese officials. Terrorist financing. Every day, we are using our authorities to counter ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the IRGC, the Haqqani Network, and others who engage in or support terrorism. We have made great progress against these groups, including ISIS, identifying and disrupting ISIS financial facilitation networks in Iraq, Syria, and anywhere ISIS operates. We will continue to target these terrorist organizations, including by cutting them off from their affiliates across the world. Likewise, FinCEN has been working to tackle the threat posed by ISIS and ISIS-inspired foreign terrorist fighters. FinCEN leverages the data it collects in order to identify and investigate foreign fighters and their financial and logistical facilitation networks, and to share information with our domestic and international partners. And we amplify the impact of our sanctions and AML measures through international coordination and cooperation. An important initiative fostering this cooperation is the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center, a collaborative approach to addressing the evolving threats arising from terrorist financing. The TFTC is a joint effort between the United States and GCC countries, and through it, we have already taken coordinated multilateral action to disrupt terror finance networks. In October 2017, for example, all members of the TFTC designated 13 leaders, financiers, and facilitators of the ISIS Yemen and AQAP who were directly responsible for perpetuating the violence plaguing Yemen and threatening the security of the entire region. This initiative is a top national security priority for this administration, and we are continuing to work with all Gulf countries to fully realize the vision for the TFTC. As you can see, Treasury's authorities continue to serve as some of this administration's top non-kinetic tools of choice. As we continually strive to be even more impactful, we also need to add to our resources. Deploying our authorities takes a tremendous amount of hard work, strategic thinking, and intelligence. Our actions involve collaboration with law enforcement partners, the State Department, and the intelligence community. That is why we have asked Congress for more resources. The administration recently requested $25 million above the President's FY 2018 budget for TFI to fund the TFTC and to immediately deploy additional resources to counter threats posed by North Korea. The President's FY 2019 budget requests a $40 million increase from our current operating level. If we're going to continue to use our authorities for maximum impact, while attracting the best talents and minds to focus strategically on the use of our authorities, we need more people and even better tools. At a TFI town hall a few months ago, I also started my remarks by speaking about the history of this great organization. I asked that each person in the room put themselves in the shoes of those Treasury officials over 70 years ago who found strategic and innovative ways to deploy economic authorities to keep assets out of the hands of bad actors and to save victims of the Holocaust. And as I asked them to put themselves in the shoes of John Pele and others, I reminded them that is exactly where they are today. There are terrible things happening around the world right now, and we live in a time where there are grave threats to our country. Each one of our career professionals stand as an important part of the mission to keep not only our country safe, but to prevent and deter other threats around the world by illicit actors and financiers. And we are dedicated to taking our work further. I could not be any prouder to lead this effort. Thank you.
That was excellent, and it means my suspicions were right. You know what it's about, and thank you for that speech. That was just terrific. Well, colleagues and all who are listening, that, I believe, concludes our program for today. I hope it has been useful. The Atlantic Council is going to be continuing its work on sanctions, both issue-specific, general best practices, business perspective, regional perspective, and we invite you all to participate. It's great to be here with so many colleagues, friends, and associates. So thank you all for coming. That concludes today's program.